This is a basic introduction to the poem When We Two Parted by Lord Byron. And as ever with any poem, there is so much to kind of discuss about it and go into that don't take this as an exhaustive kind of pass through it. Do look it up online, do kind of read more about it, do come up with your own ideas in terms of thinking and supplement anything I say here with things you get from different sources that can be justified in with reference to the text. So if we look at it, first of all, I'm not going to read it out. You can do that yourself and try and read it out loud so you can get an idea of the rhythm and the shape of the poem. But if we look at the title, first of all, that's a good way into any poem, is the title leading you to expect what you get. And here we have When We Two Parted. So it's going to kind of lead into the first line. And the idea of it just being used as a title, there's a sense of lack of completeness there. You have to carry on reading to find out what happens when they break up. And in fact, the answer by the end of the poem is he's still suffering, he's still bitter. So if we look at the idea of who's speaking, it's a monologue. It may be an internal monologue, it may be mimicking these internal thoughts, but it is a speaker apparently speaking to or addressing, not directly in terms of she's not there, but he is directing it to his former lover. And if we look at the context on this side, Lord Byron, George Gordon Byron, was known very much as a kind of bad boy of the Romantic period. Famous quotation about him was that he was mad, bad and dangerous to know. And the brief kind of background to this poem, which is meant to be based on an experience from his life, is that there was a big scandal in 1816, I think, involving Lady Frances Wedderburn Webster, who had been caught having an affair. She'd been caught with somebody other than her husband. And she was rumoured earlier, a couple of years earlier, to be linked to Byron, having had an affair with him as well. And there's actually, you'll find in various places, and it's available on the internet, there is a missing verse to this poem, a missing stanza. And the final stanza really does kind of blame her, and it names her. And when he published the poem, he decided to spare her embarrassment and her shame further. And so he cut the verse that identified her. But it does still exist, and kind of everybody knows it's her. What you do need in terms of context is maybe if you're talking about the accusatory or the bitter tone of this male speaker, you can bring in a reference to the kind of double standards. You know, the blame and the accusation and the fault is apparently all hers in terms of, you know, her femininity, her behaviour, etc. So if you look at it going through, when we two parted in silence and tears, half broken-hearted to sever for years, you can point out the writer's or the speaker's use of that pronoun. They are together, and then by the end of the line, they have split up. So a poem about separation, but he is still kind of alluding, still referring to their shared experience. So when we two parted in silence and tears, that idea of not being able to say anything but experiencing this massive emotion is a romantic, and that's romantic as in the romantic period with a capital R. It's a romantic idea, the inadequacy of language. So look out for the idea of not being able to convey something but feeling the extreme emotion. And the half-broken-hearted parting is ambiguous. It could mean two things. It could mean that half of the couple was broken-hearted. Okay, so they split up, half broken-hearted. Or were they not, or was he not fully broken-hearted? He was just a bit upset. So there's an ambiguity in terms of his feelings at that point. And the use of the word sever has that connection with kind of violence and cutting and a kind of decisive ending of something. So they break up for years and are apart for years. He describes her as getting paler and colder, and that's both emotional and physical as the kind of breakup takes its toll. But this is a poem that's going to include a lot of imagery of death and loss, and so it's worth looking out for it as we go through it and then grouping it together. So when you write about the poem, you can say, you know, the use of the imagery of death and loss used by Byron creates and go through it all in one block. So you've got that idea of, corpse-like almost. You can talk about the consonants, that sharp K sound, cheek, cold, colder, kiss. She is both physically and emotionally cold. That's the kind of severance. And he gets this kind of bad feeling about it all, this idea that this is going to be something that's going to last for a long time. So this is a speaker who can't move on, and is increasingly arguably bitter about his experience. So that hour foretold sorrow to this, from that hour, it was clear from then to now there was going to be sorrow involved. And she seems maybe to have been the person, if not instigating it, then reacting to it as she grows emotionally cold. He then kind of remembers the dew of the morning sunk chill on my brow, more images of cold and drop of temperature reflecting feeling. So you can talk about pathetic fallacy there. The dew, mimicking the tears of the previous stanza. You've got the idea of mourning and also the kind of little sound game there. It could be a sound allusion to mourning in terms of death. And again, this idea of portents, things, predicting the future. So the first stanza has truly that hour foretold sorrow to this, and this one has it felt like the warning of what I feel now. Again, this is a speaker who can't get over this particular moment. Then the tone changes as the tense changes. Thy vows are all broken, and light is thy name. So your promises are completely destroyed. Okay, and light is thy fame means your reputation is being kind of destroyed as well. Your reputation is being taken lightly. Your reputation is ruined. So there's implicit blame on her for what's happened. And if we remember, the Lady Frances, she's been caught with somebody else who's not her husband, and maybe Byron believed that he was the only person who she could be tempted to cheat with. So he's really kind of going in aggressively on the kind of, this is all your fault, this is your problem. So thy vows are all broken, light is thy name. I hear thy name spoken and share in its shame. So he's listening to her being gossiped about and implicitly feeling that he has some part of that. And feeling kind of the shame attached to her. So it's both with her and against her, almost. And the sibilance in spoke and share, its shame can mimic the whispers and the scandal that's now following her name around. And he emphasises by repeating that idea of her name is being spoken. They name thee before me and knell to mine ear. So they talk about you in front of me, and it is like a death knell as I hear it. So a knell is when you sound that bell at a funeral or so. So what is dying? What's he losing? What kind of sensation is he kind of experiencing, that every time he hears her name, it is like a bell signifying loss? And as well as psychologically reacting, he physically reacts. A shudder comes over me. You get that end stop there. And now from here on in, there's a lot of end stops and a lot of in commas and dashes, because it's that pausing and fragmentation. He's trying to process his feelings. But this one, a shudder comes over me, and then there's that dash as the end stop. Why wert thou so dear? And I mean, he could be saying, why did I value you so much when you're implicitly kind of so cheap? And, why did I love you? Revisiting their relationship properly. Or even a third one, why did I let you get so close to me? Why did I fall for you when you've turned out to be like this? So examining his motives and thoughts. He then says, they know not I knew thee who knew thee too well. Long, long shall I rue thee too deeply to tell. So these people who are speaking about her don't know about this connection, apparently. I mean, I think it was gossiped about at the time. But they mention her name in front of him, and they don't know that he knew her. And that knew has a kind of biblical connotation as well, that in the Bible, if you say somebody knew somebody, it's got the implication that they had a physical sexual relationship with them. So he does know her psychologically, he knows her kind of mentally, but he also, there's the idea that he knows her physically or sexually and knew her too well. You know, this past boundaries, this was a transgression. Then that repetition of long, long shall I rue thee. If you rue something, you regret it. And the repetition of long for such a long time, he's already demonstrating he's not moving on, emphasised by that repetition. And again, you have the kind of two twos. You know, he can't, he knew her too well, he can't tell about it. Because he feels so deeply, apparently, and also because he can't talk about it, because this is a scandal. He doesn't want to kind of embroil him, well, maybe he does want to embroil himself in more scandal. It's Byron after all, but he can't talk about it. So again, the silence and tears idea comes through again, as well as the romantic idea of, you know, language isn't enough. Then the final stanza starts to echo the first stanza. You've got your secrets and silence at the start. In secret we met, in silence I grieve. So that although they met in secret, he's now only able to kind of go over his feelings by himself. He can't share anything. And again, grieve has that repeated idea of death. He feels this as an actual loss. And he's grieving that thy heart could forget and thy spirit deceive. And it's an interesting question if we're looking at kind of male and female standards and what he's actually upset about. He seems to be upset that she's forgotten him and that she lied to him, implying that maybe it's not the loss of the relationship, or the loss of her rather, it's the fact that, you know, there were all these promises made that he would be the one and only she'd cheat with, and yet she seems to have done it again. So that, you know, he's grieving that she could forget and deceive. And then from a poem that's in the present, he moves into the future, but it's this weird kind of future contemplation that's still stuck in the kind of past almost. Because he says, if I meet you again, how am I going to greet you? Well, with silence and tears. So we come straight back round in this kind of cyclical way to he hasn't moved on, he can't move on, he's not intending to move on in terms of that shift. And as the poem kind of moves on, or as the poem kind of progresses, you've got this kind of end stop, the repeated dashes, the fragmentation, that's showing kind of either his upset or his reflection or his kind of pausing. Form and structure wise, obviously you can comment about the fact that it is a monologue, the idea that it does have a rhyme scheme there, and again, like some of the poems in the anthology, if you're studying this for GCSE, that there is this idea of being trapped within the structure of the poem, the idea that it comes back to end exactly where it started. It's got a regular rhyme scheme and a regular rhythm, and you can argue that he is trying to hide, badly, a bitter tone through that kind of politeness and formality, much like his kind of behaviour is being moderated superficially by social convention, but really everything's going on under the surface. It's not he's not having these relationships, it's just they're not being acknowledged in kind of polite society. So there's quite a lot there. If you are writing about it, then make sure you've got those points that are to do with the imagery, make sure you've got close reading at a word level points, make sure you've got form and structure points, and make sure actually that you're looking at this from a point of view where you're bringing in specifically poetic techniques. So best answers on poems acknowledge the fact that this could only be a poem by talking about things like rhyme, rhythm, meter. If you look at that third stanza, you can see I've circled the blue, me, thee. Should it be equal blame, but he's putting himself first, maybe. The rhyme scheme is still connecting them, maybe he's connecting them together. So there's all sorts of points that you should be pulling out that are specifically poetic. And the more you can do that, the more you can persuade your reader that you really are kind of analysing the kind of poetic genre as well as all of the language stuff that's going on there. I hope that was useful. Bye now.